were kept at the Wynberg Military Hospital in Cape Town before it was sent home to the Gamtoos Valley in the Eastern Cape. On the 4th of August, she had an enrobing ceremony, which was a preparation for burial. The burial took place on the Vergaderingskop, that's in Hankie in the Eastern Cape, overlooking the farmlands, as you see there in the picture. And this event garnered international attention. It was broadcast on the SABC for the entirety of the day. Myself, I was a little boy, probably 9 or 10 years old. I did not understand everything I've literally just presented to you all. And my mother was the one that said, come and sit down, Robin, and come and observe this. And also today, I never knew that, again, like the 30 Years of Democracy event, that I would present this presentation to all you wonderful people online, as well as my colleagues in the auditorium over here. So cabinet ministers were in attendance. Former President Thabo Mbeki was the main speaker. And then also there were members of the French government, representatives, and also members of the Khoi and San community. So the commemoration of Saartjie Baartman today, as you can see there, a name is alive 235 years after birth, 209 after death, and 22 years after repatriation and burial. And a grave has been declared as a national heritage site that is under the jurisdiction of our organization, that is SARA. The Saartjie Baartman Center for Women and Children in Cape Town for abused victims, the Sarah Baartman offshore patrol vessel that you see there that protects our coastline from poaching and illegal fishing efforts, and then also the Sarah Baartman municipality that's in the Eastern Cape is the biggest district municipality. And then the Sarah Baartman Hall, that's the hall that I graduated in at the University of Cape Town, that has been renamed there. Then also there's road names, such as what you see there, and also she's also been depicted in the culture sector and the arts and media fraternity. As you can see, there was comparisons made to the person on the screen there, that is Beyonce, and there were questions that arose. So that being said, I thank you all, and this is now where I will ask Dr. Ferris if she would like to render the poem, and then we will just go into a discussion. So thank you.
Want me to do the poem?
Yeah. So Dr. Ferris,
Yes.
it's over to you. You can do the poem. Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to recite it, we can just put the cameras.
Yeah. Where do I look?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or do you want to say it out of your head instead?
Hey?
Do you want to rather recite it?
No, I want to recite it, so
Okay,
I don't
sure.
have to look.
No, you don't have
my
to.
face.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
You can just have Dr. Ferris on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for that very extensive and comprehensive presentation. Made me emotional again. And I would say that this poem was the first request for the repatriation of Sarah Baartman. I've come to take you home. Home. Do you remember the veld? The lush green grass beneath the big oak trees. The air is cool there, and the sun does not burn. I have made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint. The proteas stand in yellow and white. And the water in the stream chuckles sing-songs as it hobbles along over little stones. I've come to wrench you away from the poking eyes of the man-made monster who lives in the dark with his clutches of imperialism, who dissects your body bit by bit, who likens your soul to that of Satan and declares himself the ultimate God. I've come to soothe your heavy heart. I offer my bosom to your weary soul. I will cover your face with the palms of my hands, run my lips over the lines in your neck, feast my eyes on the beauty of you, and I will sing for you, for I have come to bring you peace. I've come to take you home where the ancient mountains shout your name, I have made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint. The proteas stand in yellow and white. I've come to take you home where I will sing for you. For you have brought me peace. For you have brought us peace. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Ferris, for that moving tribute that I've heard it before, but I must admit it always gets me again. And having researched this topic, yeah, it's emotional because it has to stir you. I don't think you can listen to it and actually not be stirred, or at least not be reflective of what she has possibly gone through, and also how she was alone over there in Europe, and had all these brooding eyes and these nasty comments and
Yeah.
remarks, and the absolute disgusting treatment that she obviously
Yeah.
underwent. So thank you very much for that. And also, with that being said, I mean, how many other Sarki Bartmans are there? Perhaps not across the globe, or that there were. It's just that we knew that who she was because she was recorded.
Yeah.
So those are just some points to ponder on. I just have some questions for you, Dr. Ferris. So how did you actually get involved? I mean, we know that Senator Nicola Abu, obviously got in contact, but if you can maybe just talk us through some salient points of how you got involved with the program, or with the repatriation group, and then also what was your motivation, or how did these words just come to you when you were writing this wonderful poem that you rendered?
Yes, you mentioned earlier on that I was homesick. I was, coming together with the course sexuality in the colonies. I became aware again of Sarki, and it was also the month in which my mother died the previous year. So I missed my mother. The homesickness came from there, and I missed my motherland, the way that Sarki must have missed it. And I was standing at my window and said to myself, if I miss my mother this much, how much more did she miss her mother? And I was just thinking of everything that she was going through. And I was in the Netherlands, and I had two CDs. One that I could play. One that soothed me was Sibongile Kumalo's song on the CD called "Little Girl," and yeah, so that also had I think an influence on the poem. I was just very sad that night, and it was for me as if I heard a voice calling, "I want to go home. I want to go home." And that is where I turned around and went to my desk and wrote that first line, "I've come to take you home," never knowing how prophetic that may be or is going to be. Well, back in South Africa, the poem went onto the internet on Willie Bester, our great artist's website, and it is there where the senator saw the poem. And I remember the senator sending me an email and saying, "Dear Miss Ferris, we were emotionally removed by your poem." But, okay, Senator, you actually meant moved.
Yeah.
And
Translation.
yeah, he wrote to me and asked me. He came across the poem and was so moved by it, and showed how we felt about her remain still being in Paris, that he thought that he is going to try and do something. Um, Remember, the French made a law in 1850, as you said, that all artifacts in French museums belong to the French state. So she was an artifact, and she belonged to the French state. And if you want to do anything with stuff that belongs to the state, there needs to be a law. So he asked me if he could translate the poem into French so that he could use it as part of the bill that he was writing, the bill that he was going to introduce in the Senate. Well, of course, I almost jumped through the roof. He showed me the translation, And he also said to me that on the 29th of January 2002, they will debate this bill he's introducing. And on the 28th, we sat in a building in Cape Town and we prayed and we drank our herbs and we burned some buchu and and said nobody will vote against it. And it was like that. Nobody voted against it. And well, it was a first in French history, as you said, on the 27th of April, as you said. Or before that, I was asked by our government to accompany the official delegation to receive the remains and also to recite the poem. It was a tearful journey. Yeah, lots of tears I cried. And the morning of the handing over of the remains, we had to go see that they packed the remains properly. Yeah. And we just went around a little corner, myself and the journalist Goldsmith. And, you know, in that room that we went into, there were hundreds of skeletons hanging on hangers, small ones, big ones. Whose mother? Whose child? You know? And later on, it was the ceremony. And the first French minister that spoke, I think it was the Minister of Research, said, we must ask ourselves, who is the real monster in the story? Yeah. And then it was my time to recite the poem. And one of our officials said to me, you must hurry because the French minister must still go somewhere. And I said, what? Me hurrying? I didn't say to her. But what I did is I asked the French assistant of the minister, of Senator Abu, to read two stanzas in French. And when she was done, I took out my harmonica and I blew a song that I wrote for Sarki, put the harmonica away and sang the song. And then only I recited the poem. I said to myself, we waited 200 years. So he was going to wait. And then after that, the senator showed us the Senate and where he stood when he read the poem. On the 3rd, we left. And when we, got into the air, I said, Paris, never again. And as you said, as we entered Johannesburg's airspace the next day, the pilot announced, we welcome Sarah Baartman back into her country of birth after 192 years. That is something I could never say without crying. So yeah, you said all the other things. We came to Johannesburg, we landed in Cape Town. We had a ceremony for enrobing ceremony because she had to parade half naked, so much in her life. And and in September 2009, the reference group was appointed. I served on there. We had to decide where she was going to be buried, how she was going to be buried. And it was decided on Hankie. Yeah, I think for time, I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ferris. I mean, like literally, I've jotted down some questions, but you've essentially answered because now I don't need to even what was this where. And I think that you've given a good overview of everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your work has definitely been noted in this country, and I mean, you are jotted down black on white. So your name, the things you've done, it definitely will be honored. And myself, as a young professional in this space, I can go out and hopefully others as well, that we can go and tell the story of who she was and actually what happened. So just to conclude my presentation here, just to come back. So yes, my concluding remarks. I see the screen's not moving. Okay, we are moving. Yes, thank you. So my concluding remarks, South Africa, as we've just heard now, we've come a long way of addressing the topic of, we have a long way, of addressing the topic of repatriation. It is associated with the pains of gender-based violence, oppression, exploitation, racism, sexism, in the colonial as well as even in the apartheid periods. These stories are not specifically unique, but speak to the hundreds and possibly thousands, as you've said, Dr. Ferris, in that French museum of cases of many remains remain unethically moved, that were unethically removed. So repatriation is a very technical process as seen in these cases. It's not just you pack someone in a box and you bring them back. It's laws, it's so much that goes in, it's time, it's energy, resources. Each case is different and some will require a different approach, such as the one with Chief David Stearman that was not a physical repatriation. And then it's not just about shipping remains back to South Africa, it's about restoring dignity, ensuring justice, humanizing, importantly, the person or persons, nation building, as well as healing. And South Africa has made progress, but definitely more needs to be made in telling the story of people who shaped our country and contributed to who and to what we are today. And with that, I thank you. So, thank you. And in essence of time, I will now also proceed to our last speaker for the day. That is Dr. Jonathan Schaafman. He's also a SARA council member. Dr. Schaafman, I'll just give an introduction, is a graduate from the University of Cape Town, and he graduated in 1999 with a master's degree in maritime archaeology. He worked on various shipwreck excavation projects, the Gros Wiener of 1782 being one of them. And then in 2003, he joined the South African Heritage Resource Agency, and from the year 2005, he was the manager of the Maritime Underwater Cultural Heritage Unit, or our MUCH unit, as we know internally. And then he formed the African Heritage Center for Heritage Activities. That was in January 2013. In 2017, he was a postdoc associate at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and is now a current lecturer there. His PhD, which he completed, is in maritime archaeology at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands in 2017. And the alternate approaches that he deals with is the identification and management of maritime and underwater cultural heritage in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Jonathan Schaafman, if you can hear me, you can proceed now with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my screen. Sorry, I am not used to using Teams, so I hope that this will work.
You can share. You can go ahead and share, sir. Yes, there we can see. Thank you. You can proceed.
Great, thank you very much. I want to, as brief as I can, talk a little bit about underwater cultural heritage, and particularly underwater cultural heritage management in the last 30 years in South Africa. I started out as a maritime archaeologist just over 30 years ago, in fact. And I became a maritime archaeologist really to impress Bill. I had this image of what maritime archaeology and underwater cultural heritage was about, and it was about sharks and treasure, exciting diving and being able to dress like a pirate. And it lived up to all those expectations, but there was a good reason that I thought that was probably what most people would think about at the time, and probably still do when they think about maritime archaeology or underwater cultural heritage. And I suspect if you ask people what they thought about this, what their impression was, the story would be a little bit like this. And I apologize to people who have seen this before, and I'd like to give thanks to Tony for inspiring the following slides. I think when you say maritime archaeology, it's the image that people have starts out a bit like this. There's a ship on the high seas, and everything's going well. At some point, a little bit of trouble develops, which rapidly gets worse, until everything falls to pieces. And then not much happens for a very long time, until somebody turns up a little piece of evidence in an archive, in somebody's attic, a junk shop, which archaeologists look at, they study, they go out searching for shipwrecks, they search high and low. Here's an example of low, until they find a site, which of course always looks like this, a ship sitting on the seabed. They start to collect the objects, which generally look like this, possibly like that. They study what they find, leads to some healthy academic debate, some re-examination of the finds, and then everything gets put into museums.
Excuse me, Dr. Schaafman,
Yes.
your presentation isn't moving though, unless you are just speaking to the point, to the one that's on the screen.
It should be moving. I'm not sure what is on your screen.
Yeah, it's the one that says 30 years of maritime and underwater cultural heritage in South Africa.
Let me see if I can try and share again. Let's see what happens here.
Tell them to put it on presentation mode.
Can you maybe put it on presentation mode, and then you can just flick with your arrows.
It is on presentation mode. Can you see it now?
Yes, we're looking at a man that's looking at a hat and a sword in a glass box.
Right. And hopefully you can now see the next picture.
Yes,
which
that's
is of the old side.
yes.
Okay, great.
Please proceed.
So there was this idea of what maritime archaeology was. That it's this idea of looking at shipwrecks, everything's on the bottom of the sea. There's these wonderful finds that come out. It's usually treasure. And there was a reason that we knew those things. It's a reason that we associated those things with maritime archaeology in South Africa and with underwater cultural heritage in South Africa. And this was based very much in two distinct sectors. First of all, this was what people thought that we should know. The institutions that taught maritime history, that taught the history of South Africa, wanted us to know about these ships, about these shiny things, promoting the glory of empire. The reason that one section of the European empires that were developing both in Africa and around the world. What we got when we were looking at the history of South Africa was not quite the full picture. And if we look at that full picture, South African history goes back 3.6 million years when the first hominids appeared in South Africa. Instead, what we saw was just a little section in the middle. Those ideas about South Africa pre-colonization didn't really exist. We heard about European explorers rounding the Cape in 1488. We learned about colonization, and I put that in inverted commas because what they thought they were doing was the civilization of Africa. In fact, Union of South Africa in 1910, the development of apartheid in 1948, and then the Republic of 1960, and everything else was ignored. The idea of the full scope of South African history and the depth of South Africa wasn't seen. And those shipwrecks perfectly represented this idea of Europeans coming to the African continent and civilizing it and making it into something that it hadn't been before. On the other hand, we were looking at a very specific part of that underwater cultural heritage. We were looking at something that essentially showed this glory again, gold. We were looking at these treasure ships. We were looking at amazing things coming out of the sea. And this was because of the way that people approached that heritage. Because we're ignoring everything else, we want to promote a specific element of it. We want to promote this idea of treasure. We want to promote that idea of global trade. And we want to promote that idea of Europeans participating in this and, as I said before, civilizing the rest of the world, taking the glory of empire to other places like Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So as treasure hunting became the thing that people were doing, this narrative was put firmly into place. We understood South Africa's maritime past. We understood maritime archaeology in the context of treasure hunting and these beautiful things that they were showing. We saw newspaper articles about treasures being discovered, about big ceramic holes being discovered off the coast of South Africa and various other places. Although archaeologists were looking at things differently, perhaps, in that context, it was this idea of bringing things off the seabed history. It looked like they were doing archaeology. They were doing the same thing archaeologists on land were doing. They were bringing out artifacts from the seabed. And because it's a difficult environment, of course, we shouldn't expect them to do archaeology as they would on land in the underwater environment. Added to that was this idea that these ships, although they were European, although they were the reason for the South African apartheid government to exist, this wasn't the heritage of South Africans. This was the heritage of Europe. It was somebody else's heritage. So there was no need to do the full archaeology. We really were just trying to, the treasure hunters were in this position of trying to justify their activities and to justify the apartheid government and the colonial government position in the African context and in the South African context in particular. Because of this, we saw a very different side to archaeology when it was done underwater. And we had these ideas, as I said, of these massive treasures, of this wonderful wealth that existed. Archaeology was seen as secondary. I have to say this was not only the fault of the treasure hunters and the colonial governments, this was also partly the fault of underwater archaeologists and maritime archaeologists. And I always use this example, given the choice of reading maritime and underwater cultural heritage in South Africa, the development of relevant management strategies in the historical maritime context of the southern tip of Africa, or treasure hunt, which would you pick up? I would pick up treasure hunt every day of the week. Archaeologists were not promoting what it was that they were doing. They were not promoting the value of what they were doing in the same way that treasure hunters were. They were not promoting it in the same way that the apartheid government was presenting this underwater cultural heritage and this idea of shipwrecks being the vehicles for the civilization of the continent. Archaeology as a discipline, of course, started to develop further, and maritime archaeology developed as a discipline. But it was developed in a way that was fit for purpose. It developed to deal with European problems. It developed to deal with shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, and later on, European shipwrecks traveling in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and across into the Pacific. But it didn't develop in a way that looked at the history of those other places. It didn't develop in a way that looked at the African continent. It didn't develop in a way that looked at Asia. And it didn't develop in a way that took into account that other people may be operating in those maritime spheres and have different perspectives and different ways of accessing those maritime spheres and accessing those maritime resources. So maritime archaeology was developed within this framework of Western disciplines of archaeology and Western needs and purposes. And that translated into the South African context as well. And so even though maritime archaeologists like me were starting to be trained and was starting to work in that underwater environment, it was still very much focused on this European idea of history, this Western idea of what happened with the expansion of European powers, with colonialism, and all of those other things that went with European shipping. What was the impact for South Africa? Well, although legislation did recognize shipwrecks as being heritage resources as far back as 1979 in the National Monuments Act, there was no real protection. Not until 1986, when a blanket protection for shipwrecks older than 60 years was added to the legislation, did anybody really care about what was going on? In fact, people actively encouraged salvage. People actively encouraged the return of these objects into the stream of commerce. When new legislation came into place in 1986 and all shipwrecks older than 60 years were protected, there was still very little that happened to promote maritime archaeology, to promote the exploration and investigation of these shipwreck sites. Treasure hunters still controlled the narrative, treasure hunters still controlled the work that was happening. By 1986, there were few people working in the maritime archaeological context. Legislation was developed in such a way that treasure hunters were able to keep things that they found, and they were able to determine how maritime archaeology is. And for the most part, maritime archaeology did not take place. It wasn't until 1999, when the National Heritage Resources Act was put into place, that shipwrecks were seen as equally important as terrestrial sites, when underwater cultural heritage was seen to be equivalent to the heritage that was found on archaeological sites on land. There was a 60-year blanket protection on shipwreck sites, and everything was protected in South Africa's territorial waters and contiguous zone, which is up to 24 nautical miles offshore. Wrecks were defined specifically as archaeological sites, and wrecks included bottom and jets and things that fall off ships when they become wrecked. It included aircraft, and it included those other vehicles that facilitated trade and European expansion. They were also defined as belonging to the nation, and the legislation at the time compared with the best in the world in protecting shipwreck sites. This remained problematic, however, because it still focused on a very particular element within that underwater cultural heritage, within that maritime historical narrative, and that was those shipwreck sites. When the 1999 National Heritage Resources Act was enforced, or came into force, the picture looked kind of bleak for maritime archaeologists. And I'd like to thank John Gribble for putting together these statistics at the time when SARA came into existence and the National Monuments Council fell away. At the time, there had been 141 applications for 105 different shipwrecks since 1982. 106 permits have been issued, 78% of which were for commercial projects. And that includes treasure hunting and salvage, which means that very few were for archaeological interpretation, for archaeological activities. Of those permits, 83% submitted annual reports, which means that a lot of data was lost. Only 9 final reports came out of these projects, 106 projects, and only 10 cases was any formal publication done. Less than 30 published articles came out of the entire body of evidence that had been collected between 1982 and 1999, which is a very small amount of data that we can add to the archaeological record. And this includes archaeologists. So this was the treasure hunters submitting very little, the archaeologists also submitting quite a few published articles and a few additions to the body of knowledge. In 2001, UNESCO started to look at ways, well, prior to 2001, but in 2001, a convention was promulgated in which UNESCO started to look after shipwrecks on a global scale, or underwater cultural heritage on a global scale. The convention does a great job in promoting underwater cultural heritage. It does a great job in setting out a set of guidelines which can be followed by maritime archaeologists and enthusiasts alike. But it does have some problems. It's reactionary. It was developed to counter treasure hunting. It was developed in order to try to promote maritime archaeology. But it was developed coming out of treasure hunting. It was developed as a reaction to all of the activities that were happening globally. It was expert-driven, and as I said, maritime archaeology as a discipline had been developed from this Eurocentric perspective, this Western perspective. It prioritized cultural heritage over natural heritage, and it was politicized. It was competitive, and it was exclusionary. Much of the 2001 convention, if you go and look at it, is focused, again, on this European idea of what cultural heritage is. This European idea of shipping and global trade networks and connections. So, if this is the case, does underwater cultural heritage matter? We're working in a framework within which we're looking at shipwrecks. That's what the legislation protects. We're working in a discipline that is very much rooted in Western ways of looking at the world, Western ways of interpreting the maritime world. But because of this, we're missing a lot. And it does matter. Underwater cultural heritage does matter. And I'm going to tell you, 100,000 years of maritime history. People started going to water bodies 800,000 years ago. This is at the very beginnings of humanity, at the very beginnings of the emergence of hominids, or humans as we know it. So it's a global history, and it's an important history. And it doesn't have to do entirely with shipping. It doesn't have to do entirely with that European narrative. It does have consequences, and it does have relevance in the present. 90% of our trade occurs over water. the number of ocean-going vessels has increased threefold in the last 50 years. But we always look at this. We understand this as a marginal activity, a marginal human activity. Ports are often remote. The romance of the sea, this idea of shipping and shipwrecks, and that idea of people crossing vast spaces, isn't really as strong in the public mind as it was before. In just a few generations, our perceptions of what underwater cultural heritage is and what maritime activities are has changed from seeing the sea as central to our societies to being hardly aware of its existence today. So what does this mean in the South African context? We're sitting with shipwrecks, we're sitting with European versions of history, and we're ignoring what's going on our own coastlines. SARA has worked very, very hard to examine what underwater cultural heritage is and to examine what maritime archaeology is. And together with partners around the continent, we've started to look at ways of advancing an Africanist approach to underwater cultural heritage. For me, this change occurred in the early 2000s, working on a project with the Zico Museum's Slave Wrecks project, working on a ship that had carried enslaved people. And as a European trained maritime archaeologist, I didn't think too much about what was going on there. I understood the impacts of the slave trade. I understood the impacts of these huge amounts of people being transported and relocated and captured and sent away from where they were living. But 14 million people being taken out of Africa, at least 14 million people, was too big for me to comprehend. But working on the wreck of the Saint Jose in Clifton with the Zico archaeologists, we were digging away at the site, and again, I understood those things from the fundamental archaeological perspectives of construction and trying to understand the shipboard communities. But we started to uncover an artifact. It was something that looked a bit rusty, it was difficult to make out. But as we uncovered more and more of it, we could begin to see what it was. And I was sitting on my knees at the bottom of the bay in Clifton, and seeing this object come out of the sand and recognizing it as a leg, recognizing it as something that had held somebody captive on board the ship. And my entire way of looking at the slave trade shifted in that moment. Instead of looking at this as 12, 14, 20 million people being taken off the African continent, I saw this as one person. That here was an object that had held one person on board the ship. And looking at that object, I started to imagine the life of that person. They had come from Madagascar, probably come from somewhere else before that. I'm sure they had a family. They may have been in love. They may have had children. They may have been doing something at the time. They lived somewhere. They lived within a community. They were living the life that I aspired to lead. And here was that one object, and it brought me face to face with somebody who had been enslaved. And that shift in thinking about it was an important shift, because this was not the history of the slave trade. This was not the history of Europe. It was not this giant history of millions of people. It was the history of an individual. And it made me realize that the importance of the work that we were doing lay in the fact that we were telling these individual histories, that we could connect people to individuals. And it changed the way that I looked at maritime archaeology, and it changed the way that I thought about underwater cultural heritage. And made me realize that underwater cultural heritage is not more than shipwrecks. And as SARA, we started to look at these other elements of maritime heritage and maritime history. Images of fish traps on the south coast, of submerged Iron Age settlements north of Johannesburg. The shipwreck sites that we were looking at meant different things to different people. People understood their past differently. And it was around about this time that I decided to leave SARA, because I wanted to look more closely at what was going on. I wanted to understand that Africa is a maritime continent. And we never think of it as being a maritime society, but it really is. Although it's not a seafaring society necessarily, it is a society that's very close next to the sea. And so I started to go back to shipwreck sites that I've worked on to try and understand how people viewed those sites and what those sites meant. And in doing this, we started to look at a different approach to maritime archaeology and a different approach to underwater cultural heritage. Instead of taking that stance of, this is what we want you to know, this is what we want you to know about these ships, this is what we want you to know about the impact of these ships, we started asking a new question. And that question was, what do you want us to know? And in doing that, we changed the way that we thought about it, and we understood differently what it meant to be a maritime society. We understood differently what it was to be connected with the sea. And I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead here. In doing this, we were also able to open up the maritime space, to open up conversations about that maritime history, and allow people to enter what had been an exclusionary space. The maritime space is often seen, to quote Heather Wares, the last bastion of whiteness. This is a space that we see as being European, no matter how we understand it. But this provided those opportunities for us to look at it differently and for people to present that maritime history in ways that they understood rather than ways that we understood. In doing so, we shifted our perspective from these shipwreck sites and these individual archaeological sites to thinking about maritime culture within a landscape and the connections between the elements of those landscapes. Shipwrecks were, of course, still important, but they were the ways that people used the sea for subsistence, for infrastructure, and even for as a sacred space. That water bodies could be more than just the medium through which activities occur, but in and of themselves were sacred spaces. In doing this, we started to look at that individual approach to what maritime heritage was, what underwater cultural heritage was. And why was this important? Well, there's history in all men's lives, as Shakespeare said. Who are we to argue with Shakespeare? Those individual connections, looking at those individuals within a landscape, understanding ourselves in that landscape, helped us better understand how history had evolved, how South Africa as a country had evolved, and how the African continent had evolved, regardless of what Europeans had been doing, but also inclusive of what Europeans had been doing. This was important, again, because we stopped looking at the names of things. We stopped looking at how ships were constructed, and we started to understand, or try to understand, what was going on those sites, what the impacts were, and how people viewed the sea, as I said before. So to use another quote from Richard Feynman, you can know the name of a bird in all the languages of the world, but when you finish it, you'll know nothing whatsoever about the bird. So let's look at the bird and see what it's doing. That's what counts. I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. And through adopting this new approach to underwater cultural heritage, we started to know them beyond names and things. We started to understand better and know the processes, the activities, and the relationships associated with water bodies. Did this mean that we weren't doing maritime archaeology as we've done before? Did it mean that these ideas of how to practice maritime archaeology fell away? No. But it did mean that we were looking at things in different ways and we could understand things in different ways. And it forced us to expand maritime archaeology and to take a different approach to maritime archaeology and to develop an African perspective of what maritime archaeology is and how maritime archaeology is done. And through that change of approach, I think in the last 30 years, we've developed not just a new way of understanding the maritime context, but also in promoting maritime archaeology as something that is important for African practitioners. Did that mean that maritime archaeology wasn't that cool thing with sharks and treasure and excitement and dressing like a pirate? It didn't. I still get to do all of those things, but I get to do them in a different way, and I get to do them in a more important way than I did before. And I get to do them in a way that is relevant for us as South Africans and for us as people living on the African continent. And SARA has been at the the coalface of that. SARA has been spearheading those new approaches and those new ways of looking at underwater cultural heritage that is inclusive and that is open to interpretation by multiple stakeholders, by multiple people engaging with maritime spaces and maritime heritage. I'm going to stop sharing and leave it there for the moment, but thank you for listening and thank you for giving me the time to present this work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaafman, for that interesting take also on heritage. When we think about heritage, it's not just that's on the land. I mean, it's also beneath the sea. It's the buildings. It's so many other things than just what we have come to know, or maybe even little artifacts thereof. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I have one question here, and then maybe you can answer this one for me, please. So how do you protect the underwater heritage sites or underwater cultural heritage in the face of the open seas, whereby, as you've said, there are treasure hunters, and yeah, there's some people that would just dive with their own equipment to see maybe a shipwreck, the South Jose in Clifton, and then you would literally have people going there to physically trying to break this thing down just maliciously. So is there perhaps a way, because I mean, if you think about the sea is open. Anyone can just get in a car and drive down to the beach and get in a swim costume and go and swim. So I'm just curious. Thanks.
Thanks, and a great question, and I'm sorry I didn't answer in the presentation. I think by taking this new approach, we're able to better protect the underwater cultural heritage. Sorry, I can switch on my camera as well if you would like. We can, and we've seen this in action off the south coast. Recently, there were protests regarding fracking off the coast, a long way offshore. But part of the reason that people wanted to stop fracking, part of the reason why people wanted to stop offshore mining, was because of the importance of that maritime space in lifeways, in the way people understand the sea and what happens in the sea. In opening up the space to new voices, we've also realized that the natural heritage is as important to us as the cultural heritage. The way people understand the sea is not just through those cultural objects, not just through those archaeological artifacts, but through the physical space, the idea of the sea itself and the things that exist within the sea. So this approach promotes the protection of cultural heritage, it promotes the protection of natural heritage. Natural heritage in that people want to see those spaces preserved, and cultural heritage in that it gives people a stake in those things that are happening in the sea. So even though a shipwreck may be not directly related to your heritage, it forms part of that broader context, it forms part of that landscape. And that's something that people find important. And because that's important, people want to protect that. So I think by opening that space, we can better protect those spaces, and we can hand that protection over to the people to whom it matters, rather than us deciding what's important. We, the people that are there, the people that relate to those things, decide what's important and how to protect it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaafman. You're getting some positive feedback here from our colleague Kin Ngobeni that says a very awesome presentation. And then there's one from Nancy Ellen Kluter, who's a former colleague of yours, also just heaping praise on you and saying thank you. And as an ex-colleague, that she's quite proud of progress in your career to the point where you are today. And then I see we got a question. I think we can make that one perhaps the last, just in the interest of time, by our colleague up in Pretoria. That's Mr. Madida. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think I've just got one question in terms of the development of that specific discipline of underwater cultural heritage within sort of Africa, in particular maybe South Africa. I mean, to what extent are the academic institutions equipped to sort of to teach that particular discipline, particularly with the underwater cultural heritage management, etc. Because it looks like the skill largely has to be imported. There are very, very few people that are there. So I'm asking that in terms of the discipline, where do you see the discipline going in sort of African academic institutions, and in particular in South Africa as well? Because the question that you asked previously on the projection, maybe that in terms of awareness and skill as well, that's there is quite a gap. So basically, I must say that, for example, I personally came into contact with underwater cultural heritage once I was at SAR, and as a student of history, that was embarrassing for me. I'm just asking that much more broadly. Thanks.
Thanks. And also a great question. And sadly, academic institutions in South Africa don't include much of underwater cultural heritage. I know who work with some universities to promote and to discuss underwater cultural heritage, but nobody offers maritime archaeology or even any kind of course specifically in maritime in underwater cultural heritage at any institution on this continent south of Egypt, which is sad, because there are maritime archaeologists, there are people engaged in PhDs in maritime archaeology, but they are having to make their own way largely, and they rely, as you said, on that external expertise. Although there are universities in South Africa, those institutions will bestow the PhDs on them, they rely on outsiders. I think it's very sad that this is not something that is promoted more. I think ignoring underwater cultural heritage is sad and does us a disservice. I think it is something important. As I said, this is something that we've been doing for 800,000 years, and it's so much more than what we see and what we hear, the ideas that we have of maritime archaeology and shipwrecks. The Indian Ocean is a vast space which predates any of that European activity by millennia, but we don't know much about it. The east coast of Africa has been involved in international trade and has global connections. South Africa has those global connections through sites like Mapungubwe, but we never hear about those. And those global connections are intrinsically related and inextricably related to water and to maritime activities and maritime cultures, but we're not learning about those. And I think we're missing a great deal of our history and a great deal by not looking at those important elements that inform and shape the way that we have developed over the last 800,000 years.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Schaafman and Mr. Madida, for your contributions. Colleagues, with that being said, again, our humblest apologies. We have gone a little bit over time, but when these events happen, we also don't just want to cut people off because of the richness of the debate emanate from it, and also the curiosity, because else it would have just been me sitting here on the screen speaking to myself. So thank you to everyone that has contributed, that has done their presentations, that just made a comment, or even if it was in the chat, and also for yourselves just for, by being here, because I mean, without people actually attending the event, it won't be a success. So that being said, I would like to bring this day to a close, and please, 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 this is not the end. We are still up again tomorrow, which will be day 2, and that would be towards the next 30 years of heritage management in South Africa. And our program will commence, as it says, at 10. So please join in, and again, bring the energy and the passion and the rigor so that we can continue to make this event a success. And with that, I thank you, and may you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Before you leave, I'd like to invite everyone to please switch on their microphones. So please switch on your microphones. Please switch on your microphones. And please give a very round of applause to our speakers, our program director, and the Sara team for a wonderful day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well done, guys. Fantastic. All righty. Shame, I'm sure you're starving.
Hey.
Let's go and eat.